Isaac Asimov is a writer who needs no introduction. He is one of the fathers of science fiction, the inventor of the Three Laws of Robotics, and he earned a PhD in biochemistry at Columbia University, because it was precisely shortly after graduating in chemistry at the age of 21 that he wrote and published Nightfall. Nightfall was voted by the Science Fiction Writers of America as the best science fiction short story ever written before the institution of the Nebula Award. We will therefore analyze it and discovering the themes it addresses and what it can still teach us today. Obviously, spoiler alert. We can find Nightfall in two forms, a short story and a novel, but let us start from the beginning. Nightfall was published in September 1941 in the magazine Astonishing Science Fiction, edited by John Campbell, and it was born from an intellectual challenge. In fact, Campbell asked Asimov to write a story after the two of them had discussed a quotation by the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God? Well, Campbell held the opposite opinion and said, I think they would go mad. And so he asked Asimov to write a short story based on these premises, and they chose the title together. After 47 years, in 1988, Martin Greenberg, a friend and colleague of Asimov, convinced him to look for someone who could turn Nightfall into a proper novel, while keeping the story unchanged. Thus, in 1990, only 2 years before Asimov's death in 1992, the homonymous novel Nightfall was published in collaboration with Robert Silverberg. In his posthumous autobiography in 1994, Asimov writes the following. Eventually, I received the extended Nightfall manuscript from Bob Silverberg. Bob did a wonderful job, and I could almost believe I had written the whole thing myself. He remained absolutely faithful to the original story, and I had very little to argue with. The novel broadens the investigation, explores different places, and deepens the themes, but it is the short version of 1941 that has remained impressed in the collective imagination. Nightfall takes place on Lagash, or Kagash in the novel, a planet orbiting in a system with 6 suns, which guarantee perpetual light. Areas of darkness exist in enclosed places on Lagash, such as caves, tunnels, and windowless rooms. But night never falls, because at least one sun is always present in the sky and at any given moment. In this perpetually illuminated world, a skeptical journalist visits a university observatory, where a group of scientists claims that the civilization of Lagash is close to destruction. The scholars explain that they have discovered traces of numerous previous civilizations, all annihilated by fire at regular intervals of about 2,000 years. Ancient religious texts, considered apocalyptic superstitions, speaks of an age in which the planet passes through a great cave and mysterious stars appear in the sky, casting flames and madness upon humankind. By cross-referencing these legends with new studies, the scientists developed a rational explanation. Lagash possesses a moon that is invisible in the eternal daylight in which the planet is immersed, which every 2049 years causes a total eclipse when a single sun remains in the sky, bringing night to Lagash. Since the inhabitants of Lagash have evolved without ever knowing the day-night cycle, darkness arouses in them a primordial terror. Psychological experiments shows that just a few minutes of darkness are enough to cause irreversible madness or death. The imminent eclipse, destined to last many hours and to cover the entire planet, will therefore condemn the entire population to an unprecedented darkness. According to the scientists, previous civilizations were destroyed by people who went mad during the eclipse and set fire in a desperate attempt to create light, reducing cities to ashes. The accounts of the survivors would then have fueled a religious myth. In order to break this cycle, the researchers hope to save at least a small group of individuals by sheltering them in an artificially illuminated environment and scientifically observing the event. However, they have not foreseen the most devastating impact: the stars. During the eclipse, the night sky reveals itself in all its vastness, showing tens of thousands of celestial bodies, many more than we see from our planet. The revelation of an immensely larger universe and of the insignificance of one's own world, combined with the total darkness, definitively shatters the sanity of everyone, scientists included. On the horizon, the lights of fires devouring the city announce the return to the long night and yet another collapse of the civilization. The protagonists are representative figures of different intellectual categories of Lagash society. Atom 77, director of the Sarro Observatory, represents institutional science, rational but troubled by the perspective of the event. Pheromone 762 is a skeptical and ironic journalist, the voice of the secular public that does not believe in catastrophic prophecies. Bine 25 is the young, enthusiastic astronomer, open to scientific doubt. Shirin 501 is the psychologist who has clinically studied the disease of darkness, which afflict the rare individuals of Lagash forced to experience it artificially. The cultists led by Latimer 25 represent the religious dimension. Their oral tradition has preserved the memory of previous catastrophes in the form of prophecy. One of the themes of the story is the dependence of the human mind on the sensory experience available in its environment. The inhabitants of Lagash are intelligent, rational, scientifically advanced to the same degree as human beings on Earth, if not more so. Today they may seem backward to us, but let us not forget that Asimov was writing in 1941, a full 28 years before the moon landing, 20 years before the first human in space, 16 years before the little dog Laika, and even 1 year before the very first V2 missile, which, empty as the head of a flat earther, managed to pierce our atmosphere and touch space. The Lagash population is advanced, yet they cannot psychologically process the sight of 1,000 of stars, because their nervous system has never developed cognitive tools to manage that experience. The story suggests that rationality is not a universal shield against reality. The mind always operates within a specific perceptual and cultural horizon, and when that horizon is radically violated, no amount of intelligence can suffice. It is not the fear of darkness itself that drives the inhabitants of Lagash mad, or at least not only that. It is the sudden revelation that the universe is infinitely larger than they had imagined. Shirin explained this clearly. Experiments in the dark chambers have shown that after just a few minutes of total darkness, Lagash individuals begin to hallucinate lights, colors, and visions. Their minds create virtual stimuli rather than endure a sensory void. But the stars are worse than darkness. They are visual and incontrovertible proof of a boundless cosmos that their cosmology, centered on a six-sun system, a relatively small and comprehensible universe, had never contemplated. This is the theme of the scientist who succumbs under the weight of his own discovery, because it reveals a truth too harsh to accept. These themes perhaps fascinate us because it tickles the epic idea of a person capable of unveiling such a fundamental truth about the cosmos, which then turn out to be far more negative than expected, and somehow we are seduced by the idea that this causes their collapse. Which in reality this makes no sense at all and had never happened to anyone. This reminds me of the story of Ludwig Boltzmann, an Austrian physicist who made a fundamental contribution to the understanding of entropy by defining it in statistical terms, and then supposedly went mad and fell into depression at the idea that the entire universe tends inexorably toward decay and chaos. when in reality he probably suffered from bipolar disorder, which also caused his depression. But somehow we like the idea that there exist truths so shocking as to make us tear our clothes and lose our minds. I mean, that makes no sense how mad this phenomena would have driven people like Copernicus or Darwin, that literally changed the whole view of the world of humankind. And also, why does all the scholars that study this subject keep their sanity? Makes no sense. Imagine yourself studying the solar system, the evolution, or the entropy, and suddenly go crazy. Makes no sense. As I told you at the beginning, the idea originates from that quotation by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who imaginated this upheaval as a state of religious ecstasy that would lead humanity to remember the city of God for many generations. Whereas the premise from which the story starts is pessimistic and aimed precisely at this theme: how would people react upon suddenly discovering a cosmic truth that they did not expect? And the answer given both by Campbell and Asimov is that they would not be able to handle it and they would go mad. Another clear theme is that of the cyclicality of history. The cultists have preserved the memory of the previous cycle, but in a mythological and religious form, not a scientific one. The astronomers of the Sarah Observatory, on the other hand, have deduced the cycle through the analysis of geological data and legends. Every 2,000 years, Lagash burns. Civilizations are built, reach a level of development comparable to the present one, and then collapse within the span of a single night. This cyclicality of history strongly reminds me of the cyclicality of time underlying in the mythology of many ancient cultures, such as a Greek or Norse one, in which time is not structured linearly but as an infinite cycle of death and rebirth. The pattern we find in Nightfall resembles that of Ragnarok in Norse mythology. The end of the world not as the consequence of a moral or political failure, but as an inevitable event inscribed in the very structure of the cosmos, after which the cycle begins again. The cause of the collapse is not internal to the civilization, it's not moral corruption, decadence, purely cosmological. The civilization of Lagash does not fail because it is weak or evil, it fails because of the intrinsic inability of human beings to process a concept that our minds did not evolve to process. The absence of a giving stimulus does not allow the brain to learn how to process it. Only by experiencing the stimulus in a constant and repeated way, having the opportunity to study it, can we be able to understand it. And knowledge, as often happens, removes the fear of the unknown, which is the most atavic fear. As in the Norse vision, after destruction the world is reborn, a new civilization will build from the ashes of the previous one, almost certainly unaware of what came before, destined to follow the same arc. The observatory and the microfilm archive, which the protagonists have prepared to survive the catastrophe, represent the futile attempt to break the cycle, a gesture reminiscent of the Norse god who, despite knowing the destiny of Ragnarok, continued to fight nonetheless. An interesting aspect of the story is the way in which Asimov treats the relationship between science and religion. At first glance, the opposition seems clear. On one side, the scientists of the observatory who have calculated the eclipses, on the other side, the cultists who await it as the fulfillment of a prophecy. But things are more complex than they appear, because both are right in their own way. The cultists believe that the arrival of the eclipse will announce the end of the world. They have preserved this prophecy through generations for 2,000 years. The scientists, on the other hand, have reached the same conclusion through a completely different path. Geological data show layers of ash at regular intervals. In this way, it might seem that Asimov is placing the religion and scientific approach on the same level on the pursuit of truth. Two different but equally valid ways of preserving the same knowledge. This is true only if we overlook the fundamental facts. First, Asimov professed himself an atheist and was strongly critical of superstition and unfounded beliefs. Second, the premise on which the idea of Nightfall is based arises from the discussion of a quotation of Ralph Waldo Emerson that drips with religious fervor. Although the idea was to overcome the concept and transform ecstasy into anguish, Asimov retained the religious theme. And the people of Lagash do in fact preserve the memory of the stars for many generations, as Emerson said. But it is a fanaticism born of terror, a perversion of the ecstasy imagined by the poet. We can therefore state that although both approaches, the geological and cosmological studies on one hand, and the myths of fire and the destruction of the world on the other, proved necessary for the inhabitants of Lagash to arrive at a solution and intuit the frequency of the eclipse, Asimov does not in any way intend to suggest an equivalence between religion and science as instrument for knowing and preserving knowledge. These mythological elements function rather as a narrative device, useful for stimulating confrontation among the characters and for constructive and effective solution to the mystery of Nightfall within a purely narratological logic. Asimov used darkness as a three-layer metaphor. On the physical level, darkness is simply the absence of light, a phenomenon that the inhabitants of Lagash have never experienced except in extremely limited artificial context. On a psychological level, darkness represents the unknown, what can't be seen, what cannot be understood, and cannot be controlled. On the philosophical level, darkness is the condition of people who suddenly discovers that their image of the world was radically incomplete. The people who discover that they do not know. Darkness is the absence of knowledge. Shirin, the psychologist, is the character who best articulates this dimension. His experiments in the dark chamber show that the problem is not darkness itself, but the mental impossibility of tolerating the absence of visual stimuli for a mind that has always had at least one sun available. When the stars are added to the darkness, thousands of unknown points of light, each of which, as Beanie had discovered, is probably a distant sun, the effect is that of a cosmic revelation that the mind is not equipped to handle. The scientists, prepared to endure physical and psychological darkness, nevertheless succumb to the philosophical darkness when they discover that the universe they believe they know so well is nothing more than a microscopic fraction of the real universe, which drastically downsized their place within it, making them feel small, insignificant, and suddenly ignorant. Their discovery that the universe is indifferent to human presence, that the horizon of the knowledge extends infinitely beyond what was believed to be known, produces vertigo and anguish. This thought is reflected in existentialism, a philosophical current born from humanism that sees Kierkegaard as one of its earliest exponents, and that gains particular strength precisely during the period of the First and Second World Wars, exactly the years in which Asimov was writing, which are characterized as a dark period for humanity. Existentialism identifies anguish as the fundamental feeling arising from awareness of the intrinsic insignificance of existence, from the lack of a predetermined meaning, and from the radical responsibility of the individual. In a godless universe, full of uncertainties, humans rediscovers itself as ephemeral and purposeless. This is exactly what happens to the scientists of Nightfall when they see the stars and realize that the universe is far more immense and unknown than they had thought. But existentialism is not only pessimism. Since the lack of a purpose guaranteed and imposed from above opens up the possibility of self-determination. If life has no intrinsic purpose, it can nevertheless have the purpose that we decided to give it. In Nightfall, however, the people of Lagash does not complete this line of thought. and instead fade and fade into anguish. Asimov was interested in psychological and scientific plausibility. His treatments of fear of dark, which on Lagash is a clinically documented condition, not a character flaw, reflects a sophisticated understanding of anxiety mechanism. Shirin explained that experiments in the dark chamber are interrupted not when subjects show discomfort, but when they begin to hallucinate, because brain prefer to create false perceptions rather than endure sensory deprivation. This is consistent with what modern psychology has shown about sensory deprivation. I treated the same theme in my book Xenomilia. Let me know if you want an English translation, this is only in Italian for now, but I will translate it in English soon. Sensory deprivation tanks are in fact used to induce lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences. As demonstrated by several studies, multisensory perception is fundamental for the correct placement of consciousness within the physical body. When such integrations fails, it is not like consciousness actually leaves the body, don't fall in pseudoscientific stuff, but there's a subjective perception of a possible separation of body from mind. The genius of the story is to bring this phenomenon to a collective scale. It is not a matter of a few fragile individuals, it's the entire species of Lagash that is unequipped to endure darkness. Madness is the normal response of a normal mind to a stimuli for which it has not been evolutionary or culturally prepared. This overturns the moral judgment. The inhabitants of Lagash are not weak or irrational, they are simply themselves. The story also raises a reflection on the responsibility of those who know. Aton and his colleagues know what is about to happen. They have calculated the eclipse with precision. They know that the civilization is about to collapse, and yet they have been unable to prevent it. They lack the resources to save more than a few archives of knowledge. They have no way to psychologically prepare the mass of the population. They have no tools to prevent collective madness. Their knowledge separates them from the community, making them participant in a truth they cannot effectively share. But it does not save them nonetheless, exactly because they cannot share this knowledge with all the people of Lagash. Theramon, the journalist, has tried to bring the issue to public attention. The result has been ridicule and exclusion. This aspect of the story is extraordinarily topical. The difficulty of communicating uncomfortable scientific truths to a public unprepared to receive them. The risk that those who warn of catastrophe will be treated as alarmists or madmen is a problem that runs through the entire history of public science. It is practically Plato's allegory of the cave, the person who leaves the cave with great difficulty and discovers the truth, eager to share it with the others, return to the cave to free them, but it is ridiculed. In fact, people of the cave also respond violently in proportion to the liberator's effort, because they prefer to keep watching the reassuring shadows rather than face the great effort and suffering represented by exiting into the blinding light of sun to see the things described by the liberator. This theme has also been taken up very recently by the film Don't Look Up with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, in which the difficulty of communicating alarming scientific discoveries to the population leads humanity to ignore the real danger destined to cause its extinction. In conclusion, Nightfall is a masterpiece because it managed to be many things at once. A hard science fiction story, a psychological drama, a philosophical reflection on knowledge and its limits, a parable about the cyclicality of history. Asimov, at 21 years of age, wrote a text that is challenging to the reader's mind without becoming pedantic, and that moves without becoming sentimental. In the best tradition of science fiction with Asimov, which Asimov himself helped inaugurate, Nightfall speaks of alien in an exotic world in order to speak about human beings on Earth, our concerns, our fears, the way we react to external stimuli. How would you react if you suddenly discover that one of the fundamental truths you believed in turned out to be unfounded? How would you react if you suddenly discover yourself to be ignorant? If the world revealed itself to be more complex than you had imagined until yesterday? I hope that the answer is that you would remain calm. Take a breath and try to understand it, because there are already far too many people who go mad and set everything on fire. Today, as in 1941, when Asimov wrote this magnificent story.